Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still as the Army medic's hands moved across her uniform shirt. The military medical examination room felt smaller than usual, with fluorescent lights humming overhead. She had been through this routine dozens of times before, but today felt different. Today, Colonel Harrison himself was present, observing the standard physical examination that all new personnel assigned to Special Operations Command had to complete. "Just a routine check, Sergeant," Dr. Williams said, his voice professional but kind. "We need to clear you for active duty before you can join the team." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She had learned long ago not to show weakness, not to reveal anything that might make others question her abilities. Her record spoke for itself. Top marks in every training program, exceptional marksmanship scores, and recommendations from 3 different commanding officers. But she knew that being accepted into this elite unit would be her biggest challenge yet. Colonel Harrison stood near the window, his arms crossed behind his back. He was a man in his 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His reputation preceded him. A decorated combat veteran who had served in 3 different conflicts and was known for his tough standards. No one got into his unit without proving themselves worthy. "Doctor, how much longer will this take?" the colonel asked, glancing at his watch. "I have a briefing in 30 minutes. "Almost done, sir," Dr. Williams replied. "Just need to check for any scars or injuries that might affect field readiness." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment she had been dreading. Every military medical exam included this part, but somehow she had always managed to navigate it without too many questions. Different doctors, different bases, different situations. But today, with the colonel watching, she knew there would be no easy way around it. Dr. Williams continued his examination, checking her arms, shoulders, and legs. Everything appeared normal. The expected small marks and bruises that came with rigorous military training. Sarah began to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could get through this without having to explain her past. "I need to check your torso area now," Dr. Williams said, reaching for his stethoscope. "Just standard procedure." Sarah's mouth went dry, but she maintained her composure. She had practiced this moment in her mind countless times. She would remain calm, answer any questions professionally, and not let her personal history interfere with her military career. The doctor placed his stethoscope on her back first, listening to her breathing and heart rate. "Everything sounds good," he murmured, making notes on his clipboard. "Now I need to check the front." Sarah unbuttoned the top portion of her uniform shirt, just enough to allow the medical examination. Dr. Williams moved the stethoscope to different positions on her chest, his expression focused and professional. "Deep breath," he instructed. Sarah complied, forcing herself to breathe normally despite the anxiety building inside her. She could feel the colonel's eyes on her, though he appeared to be looking out the window at the training grounds where other soldiers were conducting exercises. "One more check," Dr. Williams said, moving to examine her abdominal area. "I need to make sure there are no hernias or other issues that could affect your physical readiness." This was it. Sarah knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. She slowly lifted her shirt, revealing her abdomen. For a moment, Dr. Williams continued his examination without any reaction. Then his hands stopped moving. The room became completely silent, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Williams stared at Sarah's abdomen, his professional composure cracking slightly. Even from across the room, Colonel Harrison noticed the doctor's sudden stillness. "Is there a problem, doctor?" the colonel asked, turning away from the window. Dr. Williams didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on what he was seeing, a massive scar that stretched across Sarah's entire abdominal area. It wasn't a simple surgical scar or the result of an appendectomy. This was something much more serious, much more traumatic. The scar tissue was thick and discolored, telling the story of a severe injury that had required extensive surgical intervention. "Doctor?" Colonel Harrison stepped closer, his voice carrying a note of authority. "Sir, I think you should see this," Dr. Williams said quietly. Colonel Harrison approached the examination table, his expression serious. He had seen his share of combat injuries over the years, had witnessed the aftermath of explosions, gunshot wounds, and other battlefield trauma. But when he looked at Sarah's abdomen, even his experienced eyes widened in shock. The scar was enormous, running from just below her rib cage down to her pelvic area. It was clearly the result of major trauma, the kind of injury that most people wouldn't survive. The surgical repair work was extensive, with multiple smaller scars crisscrossing the main one, indicating numerous operations and a long recovery process. Colonel Harrison's face went pale. He had commanded soldiers for over 20 years, had seen men and women injured in every conceivable way. But this was different. The sheer scope of the injury, combined with the fact that this young woman was standing before him, cleared for active duty, was almost incomprehensible. "My God," he whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. Sarah watched both men's reactions with a calm expression that betrayed none of the turmoil she felt inside. She had seen these looks before: shock, pity, horror, confusion. People couldn't understand how someone could survive such an injury, let alone continue serving in the military. "Sergeant Mitchell," Dr. Williams finally found his voice. This is an extraordinary injury. Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah slowly lowered her shirt, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had known this moment would come eventually. Her secret couldn't stay hidden forever, not in a military environment where medical examinations were routine and thorough. "It was an IED, sir," she said simply. "Afghanistan, 3 years ago." Colonel Harrison continued to stare at her, his mind trying to process what he had just seen. An improvised explosive device capable of causing such damage should have been fatal. The fact that Sarah was not only alive but standing before him, applying for one of the most physically demanding units in the military, defied all logic. "The medical reports," Dr. Williams said, flipping through her file. "There's no mention of this injury in your records." "The records were classified, sir," Sarah replied. "Medical privacy regulations." She wasn't lying, exactly. The full details of her injury and recovery had been classified at her request, available only to those with appropriate security clearance and a need to know. Most routine medical examinations didn't require access to that level of detail, especially when her current physical fitness ratings were excellent. Colonel Harrison walked to the window again, his mind racing. He had been expecting to meet another eager young soldier looking to prove herself in special operations. Instead, he was confronting someone whose very survival represented a level of courage and determination he rarely encountered, even among his elite troops. "Doctor, I need to see those classified records," he said, his voice tight with control. "Sir, I'll need to make some calls," Dr. Williams replied. "The clearance level required is quite high." "Make the calls." Sarah remained standing at attention, waiting for the inevitable questions. She knew her military career might be over before it really began. Commanders didn't like surprises, especially surprises that suggested their new personnel had hidden aspects to their service history. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said without turning around. "Sit down." Sarah complied, taking a seat on the examination table. The paper covering crinkled beneath her as she settled into position. Hands folded in her lap. "3 years ago, you said?" the colonel continued. "Yes, sir." "And you've been cleared for active duty since then?" "Limited duty initially, sir. Full clearance was restored 18 months ago." Colonel Harrison finally turned to face her again. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of professional assessment and personal curiosity that Sarah couldn't interpret. "How many operations?" he asked. 17, sir." The number hung in the air between them like a physical presence. 17 separate surgical procedures meant months, possibly years of recovery time. It meant pain that most people couldn't imagine, rehabilitation that would test anyone's limits, and a determination to return to service that spoke to something deeper than simple duty. Dr. Williams continued to flip through her file, looking for any reference to the extensive medical history that wasn't immediately apparent in the standard paperwork. "The injury should have been career-ending," he said, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "It almost was, sir," Sarah admitted. "The doctor said I'd never serve again, said I'd be lucky to walk normally." "But here you are," Colonel Harrison observed. "Yes, sir." The colonel studied her face, looking for any sign of the trauma that such an injury must have caused. But Sarah's expression remained composed, professional, revealing nothing of the pain she had endured or the challenges she had overcome. "The unit you're applying for is extremely demanding," he said. "Physical stress that would challenge even the healthiest soldiers. Combat situations that require absolute peak performance. I understand, sir." "Do you?" Colonel Harrison's voice carried a note of skepticism. "Because what I just saw suggests that your body has already been through more trauma than most soldiers experience in an entire career." Sarah met his gaze directly, her voice steady when she responded. "With respect, sir, what you saw is evidence that I can survive things that would stop most soldiers completely." The room fell silent again. Dr. Williams had stopped looking through the file and was watching the exchange between Sarah and the colonel with obvious interest. This wasn't a typical medical examination anymore. It had become something closer to an interview, a test of character that would determine Sarah's future. Colonel Harrison walked over to his briefcase and pulled out a secure phone. He dialed a number and waited for someone to answer. "This is Colonel Harrison," he said when the call connected. "I need immediate access to classified medical records for Sergeant Sarah Mitchell. Authorization code 77 Alpha 9. He waited while the person on the other end of the call accessed the information. Sarah could hear the faint sound of typing and muffled conversation, but couldn't make out the specific words. "I see," the colonel said after a few minutes. "Yes, I'll hold." He looked at Sarah while waiting, his expression thoughtful. She could tell he was trying to reconcile the composed, professional soldier sitting before him with whatever details were being shared about her injury and recovery. "You were lucky to have Dr. Peterson as your surgeon," he said suddenly. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Dr. Peterson's name wasn't in her standard file, which meant the colonel was now accessing her classified medical records. "Yes, sir," she replied. "He saved my life." "Multiple organ damage, massive blood loss, complications that kept you in intensive care for 6 weeks," the colonel continued, clearly reading from the information being provided to him. "The initial prognosis was death within 24 hours. Dr. Williams was listening intently now, his medical curiosity clearly piqued by the details being revealed. "But you survived," Colonel Harrison continued. "Not only survived, but fought your way through 17 surgeries, 2 years of rehabilitation, and multiple setbacks that would have ended most people's military careers permanently." Sarah nodded, but didn't speak. There wasn't much she could add to the clinical description of her recovery. The facts spoke for themselves, though they couldn't convey the full reality of what she had experienced. "Thank you," the colonel said into the phone, then ended the call. He turned to face Sarah again, his expression now showing something that might have been respect. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said formally, "your medical history is remarkable." "Thank you, sir." "It's not a compliment," he clarified. "It's a statement of fact. What you've been through would have broken most people, physically and mentally. The fact that you're here, applying for special operations, suggests either extraordinary determination or questionable judgment. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but kept her expression neutral. This was the moment when her future would be decided. Everything she had worked for, all the pain and struggle of her recovery, came down to what Colonel Harrison decided in the next few minutes. "I need to ask you a direct question," the colonel continued, "and I want a direct, honest answer." "Yes, sir. Are you trying to prove something to yourself, or are you genuinely ready to serve at the highest levels of military operation?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She had asked herself the same thing many times during her recovery and rehabilitation. Was she pushing herself because she needed to prove that her injury hadn't defeated her, or because she genuinely belonged in special operations? "Both, sir," she said finally. "I won't lie and say this isn't personal for me. The injury changed everything about how I see my service and my capabilities. But I'm not here just to prove a point. I'm here because I believe I can contribute to the mission in ways that other soldiers can't." "Explain." "I've been through something that most soldiers, thankfully, will never experience. I know what it's like to face death and keep fighting. I understand physical and mental limits in ways that can't be taught in any training program. That experience, combined with my technical skills and training, makes me valuable to a unit like yours." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. Her answer showed the kind of self-awareness that he looked for in special operations personnel. The ability to understand both strengths and weaknesses, and to articulate how personal experience translated into operational capability. "Doctor," he said, turning to Dr. Williams, "based on her current physical condition and medical clearance, do you see any reason she couldn't complete the training and operational requirements for special operations?" Dr. Williams looked at Sarah, then back at the colonel. "Her current fitness ratings are excellent. The scarring, while extensive, appears to have healed completely. If she's been cleared for full duty, then medically speaking, I don't see any contraindications." "But," the colonel prompted, sensing hesitation, "but I'd want to see her under physical stress before making a final recommendation. The scar tissue, while healed, could potentially affect her flexibility or cause discomfort under extreme conditions." Colonel Harrison considered this for a moment. "Sergeant Mitchell, are you prepared to undergo additional physical testing to demonstrate your capabilities?" "Yes, sir." "Even if it means pushing your body to limits that might aggravate old injuries?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Sir, my body has already been pushed to limits that most people don't survive. I'm not afraid of physical testing." The colonel made a decision that would change everything for Sarah. "Very well. Report to the training facility at 0600 tomorrow. You'll undergo a modified version of our standard physical assessment, with medical monitoring throughout." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," Colonel Harrison warned. "Tomorrow's test will be unlike anything you've experienced, even compared to your recovery. If you pass, you'll be accepted into the unit. If you fail, your application will be permanently rejected." Sarah stood at attention. "Understood, sir." As she prepared to leave the medical facility, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The secret of her injury was no longer hidden, at least not from the people who mattered most for her immediate future. But now came the real test, proving that her survival hadn't just been luck, but evidence of the kind of determination that special operations demanded. Colonel Harrison watched her go, his mind already planning the challenges she would face tomorrow. He had a feeling that Sergeant Sarah Mitchell was going to surprise everyone, including herself. The fluorescent lights continued humming overhead as Dr. Williams finished his paperwork, making notes that would become part of Sarah's permanent medical record. But both men knew that tomorrow would determine whether those records documented the end of a promising military career or the beginning of something extraordinary. The alarm clock screamed at 0445, but Sarah had been awake for the past hour, staring at the ceiling of her barracks room. Sleep had been elusive, her mind cycling through every possible scenario for the day ahead. She had faced physical challenges before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about meeting standards. It was about proving that her survival meant something more than just medical luck. She dressed carefully in her PT uniform, taking extra time to ensure her appearance was flawless. The morning air was crisp as she made her way across the base to the Special Operations Training Facility. Other early-rising soldiers jogged past her, beginning their daily routines, unaware that her entire future hung in the balance of the next few hours. The training facility was larger than she had expected, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. She could see various obstacle courses, climbing walls, and training areas through the windows as she approached the main entrance. Everything looked designed to push human capabilities to their absolute limits. Colonel Harrison was already waiting in the main briefing room, along with Dr. Williams and two other people Sarah didn't recognize. One was a woman in military fatigues with sergeant major stripes, her bearing suggesting years of experience in training and evaluation. The other was a man in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable look of a medical specialist. "Sergeant Mitchell, reporting as ordered," Sarah announced, standing at attention. "At ease," Colonel Harrison replied. "I want you to meet Sergeant Major Rodriguez, who oversees our physical training programs, and Dr. Kim, our sports medicine specialist, who will be monitoring your performance today." Sarah nodded to each in turn, noting the way they studied her appearance and bearing with professional assessment. "Today's evaluation will consist of 4 phases," Colonel Harrison explained. "Cardiovascular endurance, strength assessment, agility and coordination testing, and a final challenge that simulates combat conditions. Dr. Kim will be monitoring your vital signs throughout, with particular attention to how your previous injuries respond to stress." "Understood, sir." Sergeant Major Rodriguez stepped forward. "Sergeant Mitchell, I've reviewed your standard PT scores. They're impressive, but today we're not testing standard military fitness. We're testing whether you can perform at levels required for missions where failure means death for you and your team members." "Yes, ma'am." The first phase begins in 10 minutes. Dr. Kim will attach monitoring equipment, and then we'll start with a modified Cooper test, a 12-minute run designed to measure maximum distance covered. Dr. Kim approached with a portable monitoring device and began attaching sensors to Sarah's chest and arms. These will track your heart rate, breathing patterns, and muscle stress indicators. If at any point I detect dangerous levels, the test stops immediately. "Doctor," Sarah said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I've been through pain that your equipment can't measure. Don't stop the test unless my life is actually in danger." Dr. Kim looked at her with surprise, then glanced at Colonel Harrison, who nodded slightly. "Very well," the doctor agreed. "But I reserve the right to make that determination." The running track was a precisely measured oval behind the main facility. Sarah positioned herself at the starting line, watching as Sergeant Major Rodriguez checked her stopwatch and Dr. Kim verified the monitoring equipment. "Begin," Rodriguez called out. Sarah started at a steady pace, feeling the familiar rhythm of her stride and breathing. The morning sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the track. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal, her body responding as it had during countless training runs over the past 18 months. But as the intensity increased, she began to feel the difference. The scar tissue across her abdomen, usually barely noticeable during routine activities, started to create a pulling sensation that affected her breathing rhythm. She had experienced this before during particularly strenuous exercise, but never with such close medical observation. Dr. Kim watched his monitors intently, noting the slightly irregular breathing pattern and elevated stress indicators around her abdominal area. But her overall performance remained strong, her pace consistent and controlled. 8 minutes, Sergeant Major Rodriguez called out. Sarah increased her pace, pushing into the zone where most people would begin to struggle. Her legs felt strong, her cardiovascular system responding well to the demand. The pulling sensation in her abdomen intensified, but she had learned to work through that discomfort during her rehabilitation. Colonel Harrison watched from the sideline, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. He had seen many soldiers push themselves during testing, but there was something different about Sarah's approach. She wasn't fighting against her body's limitations. She was working with them, finding ways to maintain performance despite the challenges her injury created. 11 minutes, Rodriguez announced. Sarah shifted into her final gear, the pace that she could maintain for 1 minute but not much longer. Her breathing became more labored, and the monitors showed her heart rate approaching maximum levels. But her stride remained strong, her form still technically correct. Dr. Kim's eyebrows rose as he watched the readouts. Despite the obvious stress indicators from her injury site, her overall performance metrics were exceptional. She was pushing through discomfort that would slow most people significantly, yet maintaining a pace that few soldiers could match. "Time," Rodriguez called. Sarah gradually slowed to a walking pace, her breathing heavy but controlled. She walked in slow circles, allowing her heart rate to come down gradually while Dr. Kim recorded the final measurements. "Distance covered, 3.2 miles, Rodriguez announced. "That puts you in the top 5% of all candidates we've tested." Colonel Harrison approached as Sarah continued her cool-down walk. "How do you feel?" "Ready for Phase 2, sir," Sarah replied, though she was still breathing heavily. Dr. Kim was studying his readouts with obvious interest. "Colonel, her pain indicators were significant, but her performance didn't suffer. I've never seen someone maintain that level of output while clearly experiencing discomfort." "The discomfort isn't new to me," Sarah explained. "I learned to work with it during my recovery. Pain is just information. It doesn't have to control performance." Sergeant Major Rodriguez led them to the strength assessment area, which featured a variety of equipment designed to test functional strength rather than simple weightlifting capability. There were rope climbs, weighted carries, and pull-up bars, along with more specialized equipment that Sarah didn't immediately recognize. "Phase 2 consists of 6 stations," Rodriguez explained. "You'll have 3 minutes at each station to complete the required tasks. The standards are the same for everyone, no accommodations for previous injuries." "Understood, ma'am." The first station required her to climb a 30-foot rope 3 times within the time limit. Sarah approached the rope and began her ascent, using the technique she had perfected during her initial military training. The climbing motion put significant stress on her abdominal muscles, and she could feel the scar tissue stretching and pulling with each movement. Dr. Kim watched his monitors as her stress indicators spiked, but her climbing speed remained consistent. She completed the first ascent in excellent time, descended quickly, and began the second climb without hesitation. "Her pain tolerance is remarkable," Dr. Kim commented to Colonel Harrison. "Most people would slow down significantly with those stress levels." "She's not most people," the colonel replied. Sarah completed all 3 rope climbs within the time limit, though the final ascent clearly required maximum effort. As she moved to the second station, she could feel sweat forming where the monitoring equipment contacted her skin, but her focus remained sharp. The second station tested carrying capacity, a series of weighted objects that had to be moved over a specified distance using different carrying methods. Sarah lifted the first weight, a 70-pound ammunition box, and began the required movement pattern. The weight distribution put direct pressure on her abdominal area, right where the most significant scarring existed. For a moment, she felt a sharp spike of discomfort that made her pause, but she quickly adjusted her carrying technique, using her legs and shoulders more efficiently to reduce the stress on her midsection. Sergeant Major Rodriguez noticed the adjustment. "Adaptive technique," she murmured to Colonel Harrison. She's not just pushing through. She's problem-solving in real time. Sarah completed the carrying tasks with seconds to spare, then moved to the third station, pull-ups. This should have been straightforward, but as she gripped the bar and began the first repetition, she discovered that the hanging position created unexpected tension in her scar tissue. Each pull-up required her to work against not only gravity and her body weight, but also the resistance created by the scarring that limited her full range of motion. Yet she found a way to compensate, adjusting her grip and body position slightly to maintain performance. 15 repetitions required, Rodriguez called out as time started. Sarah powered through the pull-ups with determination that impressed even the experienced evaluators. Her form wasn't textbook perfect due to the accommodations she had to make, but she completed all 15 repetitions within the time limit. The fourth station presented a new challenge, a complex obstacle course that required crawling, jumping, and maneuvering through tight spaces. As Sarah approached the first obstacle, Dr. Kim noted that her stress indicators had plateaued at a high but manageable level. "She's adapted to the pain," he observed. "Her body is finding ways to function despite the limitations." The crawling portions of the course were particularly challenging, requiring her to move on her hands and knees under low barriers. This position put direct pressure on her abdominal area, but Sarah moved through each section with steady progress, never slowing down enough to suggest that the discomfort was overwhelming her determination. Colonel Harrison found himself watching not just her performance, but her problem-solving approach. At each obstacle, she quickly assessed the challenge, identified the technique that would work best with her physical limitations, and executed without hesitation. It was the kind of adaptive thinking that special operations missions demanded. The fifth station tested agility and coordination through a series of rapid direction changes and precise movements. Sarah's performance here was less affected by her injury, and she moved through the course with fluid precision that demonstrated her technical training and natural athleticism. "Time remaining, 30 seconds, Rodriguez called. The final station was a combat simulation that required her to carry a simulated wounded soldier, a 180-pound dummy, over a specified distance while navigating obstacles. This was the ultimate test of functional strength and determination. Sarah approached the dummy and assessed the best carrying technique. The weight would put enormous stress on her abdominal area, but she had no choice except to complete the task or fail the evaluation. She positioned herself carefully, lifted the dummy into a fireman's carry, and began moving toward the first obstacle. The weight was significant, and she could feel immediate strain in the area of her most serious scarring. But she had carried wounded soldiers before during her deployment, and she drew on that experience to maintain focus. Dr. Kim's monitoring equipment showed stress levels that would normally indicate immediate pain response, but Sarah's movement remained steady and purposeful. She navigated each obstacle with the dummy, adjusting her technique as needed, but never slowing down enough to suggest that she couldn't complete the task. "Remarkable," Dr. Kim said, almost to himself. "Her stress tolerance is beyond anything I've measured." Sarah completed the final station with 10 seconds remaining, setting the dummy down gently and stepping back to indicate completion. Her breathing was labored, sweat covered her face, and the monitoring equipment showed stress levels that confirmed significant physical challenge. But she remained standing, alert, and ready for whatever came next. Sergeant Major Rodriguez approached with her evaluation clipboard. All 6 stations completed within time limits, performance scores in the acceptable range for special operations candidates. Colonel Harrison studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of the exhaustion that the monitoring equipment indicated she should be experiencing, but her expression remained focused and professional. "How do you feel, Sergeant?" he asked. "Ready for Phase 3, sir." Dr. Kim was reviewing his data with obvious fascination. "Colonel, I need to point out that her performance throughout this phase should not have been possible given the stress indicators I was measuring. She was experiencing significant discomfort, but somehow maintaining output levels that most people achieve only when they're physically comfortable. Pain management was part of my rehabilitation, Sarah explained. I learned that discomfort doesn't have to equal inability. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that Sarah's injury hadn't just been something she survived. It had been something that had fundamentally changed her approach to physical challenges. The experience had taught her to function at levels that most people would consider impossible. Phase 3 begins in 15 minutes, he announced. Use that time to hydrate and prepare. Dr. Kim will continue monitoring throughout. As Sarah walked slowly around the training area during her break, she reflected on what she had accomplished so far. The morning's challenges had pushed her to levels she hadn't experienced since the final stages of her rehabilitation. But she was still standing, still capable, and still determined to prove that her survival had meaning beyond just medical success. The agility and coordination testing phase would present different challenges, ones that would test not just her strength and endurance, but her ability to perform complex movements under stress. She knew that her scar tissue might affect her flexibility and range of motion in ways that hadn't been apparent during the strength testing, but she also knew that she had already proven something important to the evaluators watching her. She wasn't just a survivor trying to prove something to herself. She was a soldier whose unique experience with adversity had taught her to perform under conditions that would stop most people completely. Colonel Harrison watched her preparation with growing respect. Whatever the afternoon's testing revealed, he had already seen enough to understand that Sergeant Sarah Mitchell represented something unusual in military service, someone whose greatest weakness had somehow become a source of extraordinary strength. The next phase would determine whether that strength could translate into the kind of performance that Special Operations missions demanded. But Sarah was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident that her journey through survival had prepared her for anything the military could devise. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the advanced training facility as Sarah prepared for the third phase of her evaluation. During her break, she had noticed other personnel gathering to observe the final testing. Word had apparently spread that something unusual was happening with today's Special Operations assessment. Dr. Kim made final adjustments to his monitoring equipment while Sergeant Major Rodriguez briefed Colonel Harrison on a series of complex obstacle courses that had been specifically designed to test agility, coordination, and decision-making under physical stress. The agility course includes balance beams, precision jumping, and tight space maneuvering, Rodriguez explained. Most candidates struggle with the psychological pressure as much as the physical demands. And Sergeant Mitchell's injury could affect her balance and flexibility, Dr. Kim added. The scar tissue might limit her range of motion in ways that haven't been apparent in the previous testing. Colonel Harrison nodded, but his attention remained focused on Sarah as she performed light stretching exercises. He had commanded soldiers for over 20 years, and he was beginning to recognize something in her approach that set her apart from typical candidates. She wasn't just preparing for a test. She was preparing for a mission. "Sergeant Mitchell," he called, "are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, sir." The agility course began with a series of balance beams set at different heights and angles. Sarah approached the first beam, which was only 6 inches wide and elevated 3 feet off the ground. The task seemed simple enough, but as she stepped onto the beam, she immediately felt how the scar tissue across her abdomen affected her core stability. Balance had never been her strongest skill, even before her injury. The extensive scarring now created additional challenges, as the tissue didn't flex and respond the same way as normal muscle would. But as she moved across the first beam, she demonstrated the same adaptive approach that had characterized her morning performance. Instead of fighting against her body's limitations, she found a slightly different stance and movement pattern that worked with her changed anatomy. Her progress was steady and controlled, though noticeably different from the textbook technique most soldiers would use. Interesting adaptation, Sergeant Major Rodriguez observed. She's compensating for core instability by using her arms and shoulders more for balance. Dr. Kim was watching his monitors intently. Her stress indicators are elevated but stable. She's found a way to work within her limitations. The second beam was narrower and higher, requiring greater precision and confidence. Sarah paused for a moment before stepping onto it, not from hesitation, but to assess the best approach given her physical constraints. Then she moved forward with determination, maintaining her balance through a combination of technique and sheer willpower. Colonel Harrison found himself impressed not just by her performance, but by her problem-solving approach. Special operations missions often required soldiers to adapt quickly to unexpected challenges, to find ways to complete objectives even when standard procedures weren't feasible. Sarah was demonstrating exactly that kind of thinking. The beam section concluded with a particularly challenging obstacle, a narrow beam that curved and changed elevation, requiring constant adjustment of balance and technique. Sarah navigated it successfully, though her approach was unconventional enough to draw attention from the small group of observers who had gathered. Next section, precision jumping, Rodriguez announced. The jumping course required participants to leap between platforms of varying sizes and distances, testing not only athletic ability but also judgment and confidence. As Sarah approached the first jump, she realized that the explosive movement required might stress her abdominal area in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The first jump was relatively simple, a 6-foot gap between platforms of equal height. Sarah gathered herself and leaped, landing securely on the target platform. But as she landed, she felt a sharp reminder of her limitations as the scar tissue stretched and pulled with the impact. Dr. Kim noticed the spike in her stress readings. "She's feeling that," he told Colonel Harrison. "But look at her recovery time." Sarah was already preparing for the second jump, which required greater distance and precision. Despite the discomfort from the first landing, she approached the second jump with unwavering focus. Her leap was technically sound, and she landed within the target zone, though the impact clearly tested her pain tolerance. The jumping section continued with increasingly difficult challenges, each one requiring Sarah to balance her desire to complete the course with the reality of her physical limitations. But what impressed the observers was her consistency. Each jump was executed with the same level of commitment and precision, regardless of the discomfort that the monitoring equipment indicated she was experiencing. "Most people's performance degrades as pain increases," Dr. Kim observed. "Hers remains constant. It's almost like she's learned to separate physical discomfort from mental focus." "That's exactly what she's done," Colonel Harrison replied. "The question is whether that ability translates to combat effectiveness." The final section of the agility course tested tight space maneuvering, crawling through confined areas, squeezing through narrow openings, and navigating obstacles that required flexibility and body awareness. This would be Sarah's greatest challenge, as the movements put direct pressure on her scarred abdominal area. The first obstacle required her to crawl through a tunnel barely wider than her shoulders. As she entered the confined space, the pressure on her abdomen was immediate and significant. But she had experienced much worse during her recovery, when simply lying in bed had been painful. She moved through the tunnel steadily, her breathing controlled despite the obvious discomfort. "Her claustrophobia tolerance is exceptional," Rodriguez noted. "Most people struggle with the psychological pressure of confined spaces, but she seems completely focused on the task." The next obstacle required her to squeeze through an opening that was barely large enough for a person of her size. The position put maximum stress on her scar tissue, and Dr. Kim's monitors showed pain levels that should have caused most people to stop. But Sarah worked through the opening systematically, never rushing but never hesitating. Colonel Harrison was beginning to understand something important about Sarah's capabilities. Her injury hadn't just taught her to tolerate pain, it had taught her to function effectively while experiencing significant discomfort. In combat situations, that ability could be invaluable. The agility phase concluded with Sarah successfully completing every obstacle, though her performance times were slightly slower than might be expected from someone without her injury history. But what she lacked in pure speed, she made up for in consistency and determination. Phase 3 complete, Sergeant Major Rodriguez announced. All objectives met within acceptable parameters. Dr. Kim was studying his data with obvious fascination. Colonel, her performance throughout this phase should be medically impossible. The stress levels I've been measuring would normally result in significant performance degradation, but her output remained consistent. Sergeant Mitchell, Colonel Harrison called. Take a 15-minute break. Hydrate and prepare for the final phase. As Sarah walked slowly around the training area, she reflected on how far she had come since the explosion that had nearly ended her life. The morning's challenges had tested her physical capabilities, but the afternoon's agility course had tested something deeper, her ability to perform complex tasks while managing significant discomfort. The final phase would be different. According to the briefing she had received, it would simulate actual combat conditions, testing not just her physical abilities, but her decision-making, tactical thinking, and performance under stress. It would be the ultimate test of whether her survival had prepared her for the kind of missions that special operations units undertook. Colonel Harrison approached her during the break. How are you holding up? Ready for the final challenge, sir? The last phase isn't just about physical performance, he explained. It's about demonstrating that you can think clearly and make sound decisions while your body is under stress. Combat situations don't allow for recovery time or optimal conditions. I understand, sir. Do you? Because what we're about to ask you to do will push every limit you've demonstrated today, simultaneously. Sarah met his gaze directly. Sir, I spent 2 years learning to think clearly while experiencing pain that most people can't imagine. I learned to make decisions about my recovery and rehabilitation while dealing with complications that could have been fatal. If I can do that, I can handle whatever you design for a training exercise. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet certainty of someone who had already faced their ultimate test and emerged victorious. The final phase took place in a specially designed facility that simulated urban combat conditions. Sarah was equipped with training weapons and tactical gear, then briefed on a complex scenario involving hostage rescue, enemy engagement, and mission completion under time pressure. You have 45 minutes to complete the scenario, Rodriguez explained. Success requires not just completing the physical challenges, but making correct tactical decisions throughout. Dr. Kim will continue monitoring your vital signs, but there will be no medical intervention unless you're in actual danger. Understood, ma'am. The scenario began with Sarah entering a darkened building where she had to navigate to a specific location while avoiding simulated enemy positions. The physical layout required crawling, climbing, and maneuvering through obstacles while carrying full combat equipment. Within the first 10 minutes, Sarah was experiencing the same level of physical stress that had characterized the most challenging portions of her earlier testing. But now she also had to maintain tactical awareness, make decisions about routes and timing, and respond to changing conditions as the scenario evolved. Dr. Fao-E Kim watched his monitors with amazement as Sarah maintained consistent performance, despite stress levels that should have significantly impaired her cognitive function. She's thinking clearly under conditions that would overwhelm most people, he reported to Colonel Harrison. The scenario escalated when Sarah reached the simulated hostage location and discovered that the rescue required her to carry an injured person while navigating back through the obstacle course. The additional weight and awkward carrying position put enormous stress on her abdominal area, but she adapted her technique and continued moving toward the extraction point. Tactical thinking remains sound, Rodriguez observed, as she watched Sarah choose an alternate route that avoided the most heavily defended enemy positions. She's not just enduring the physical challenge, she's solving the tactical problem effectively. The final portion of the scenario required Sarah to engage multiple simulated enemies while protecting the simulated hostage and maintaining progress toward the extraction point. The complex multitasking would have been challenging for any soldier, but for someone experiencing the level of physical stress that Sarah's monitors indicated, it should have been nearly impossible. But Sarah moved through the engagement with fluid precision, her tactical training evident in every decision. She used cover effectively, engaged threats in the correct order, and maintained protection for the simulated hostage throughout the action. Her physical discomfort, while clearly significant, never interfered with her tactical performance. "Mission complete," she announced as she reached the extraction point within the time limit. Colonel Harrison approached as Sarah set down her equipment and began removing the tactical gear. Her breathing was labored, sweat covered her face, and Dr. Kim's monitors showed stress levels that confirmed she had pushed herself to absolute limits. "How do you feel?" the colonel asked. "Mission accomplished, sir." It was exactly the response he had hoped to hear. Not a description of her physical condition or the challenges she had overcome, but a simple confirmation that she had completed the task successfully. Dr. Kim was reviewing his final data readings with obvious amazement. "Colonel, what she just accomplished shouldn't be medically possible. The stress levels combined with the cognitive demands should have resulted in significant performance degradation, but her tactical decision-making remained sound throughout." Sergeant Major Rodriguez approached with her evaluation forms. "All phases completed successfully. Performance scores meet or exceed standards for special operations candidates." Colonel Harrison studied Sarah as she continued her post-exercise routine, her movement still professional and controlled despite the obvious physical toll of the day's testing. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said formally, "based on today's evaluation, you have demonstrated the physical capabilities and mental resilience required for Special Operations Service." Sarah felt a surge of relief and accomplishment, but maintained her professional composure. "Thank you, sir. However," the colonel continued, "your performance has also demonstrated something else. Your injury and recovery have given you capabilities that most soldiers don't possess. Pain tolerance, stress management, and the ability to function under conditions that would incapacitate others. Yes, sir. That makes you valuable not just as a special operations soldier, but as someone who could be particularly effective in high-risk scenarios where other personnel might not be able to maintain performance." Sarah began to understand that her acceptance into special operations might involve assignments that specifically utilized her unique capabilities. "Your first assignment will be with a team specializing in high-risk extraction operations," Colonel Harrison explained. "Missions where the likelihood of injury and extreme stress is significant, and where having someone who can continue functioning under those conditions is critical. I'm honored to serve in that capacity, sir. Report to Building C at 0800 Monday for team integration training. Your new team leader is Major Thompson, who has been briefed on your capabilities and background." As Sarah prepared to leave the training facility, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The explosion that had nearly killed her had ultimately led to opportunities she might never have had otherwise. Her survival hadn't just been about medical treatment and rehabilitation. It had been about discovering capabilities she never knew she possessed. Dr. B. Kim finished packing his monitoring equipment and approached Colonel Harrison with his final assessment. "Sir, in 20 years of sports medicine and military performance evaluation, I've never documented anything like what I observed today." Her ability to maintain cognitive and physical performance under extreme stress represents a level of pain tolerance and mental discipline that's simply extraordinary. It's what happens when someone discovers that their limits are much farther out than they ever imagined, the colonel replied. Sergeant Major Rodriguez was filing her evaluation reports, but she paused to add her own observation. Sir, she didn't just pass the evaluation. She redefined what we consider possible for special operations performance under adverse conditions. Colonel Harrison watched through the window as Sarah walked across the base toward her barracks. Tomorrow she would begin a new phase of her military career, working with teams that specialized in the most dangerous and demanding missions the military undertook. But tonight, she had earned the right to simply be proud of what she had accomplished. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into evidence of capabilities that would serve her country in ways that few soldiers could match. Her scar would always be with her, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. But it was also proof that survival wasn't just about living through trauma. It was about discovering that the experience of overcoming the impossible could prepare someone for challenges that others couldn't even imagine facing. As the sun set over the training facility, Colonel Harrison made a final note in his assessment file. Sergeant Sarah Mitchell approved for Special Operations Service. Recommended for high-risk assignment due to exceptional performance under extreme stress conditions. Her unique background and capabilities make her particularly valuable for missions where standard personnel might not be able to maintain effectiveness. It was an unusual recommendation, but then again, Sarah Mitchell was an unusual soldier. Her injury had nearly ended her military career before it really began. But her recovery had revealed qualities that would make her invaluable in situations where other soldiers might fail. The scar that had shocked even experienced military medical personnel had become evidence of something much more significant than survival. It had become proof of the kind of determination and resilience that special operations missions demanded. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in Sarah's military service, one where her greatest weakness had been transformed into her greatest strength.